Hello everyone, good afternoon. My name is Lisa Endersby and I am thrilled to have the opportunity as the incoming chair of the Technology Knowledge Community, who doesn't know how to use technology properly, needs to stand in certain places apparently in order to be seen. Yep. But I wanted to officially welcome you to one of 3 Knowledge Community sponsored sessions. We are really thrilled to have the opportunity to further the research and scholarship and practice in technology in higher education and student affairs, featuring 2 of these fine folks that you will have the pleasure and privilege of learning from today. So of course, I could not stand up here without plugging the Technology Knowledge Community. If you have an interest in technology, in student affairs and higher education, our business meeting is this evening at 5:30 p.m. in the steering room at the Hilton. But of course, we are available online, Twitter, Facebook, all of those good places. We'd appreciate and love the opportunity to hear from you about what you're interested in, because we really believe in, as these 2 people are doing today, the advancement of research and scholarship in technology and higher education. So thank you for being here. Thank you for letting me speak, and enjoy. You're in for a real treat today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you,
Lisa.
Thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Ready to go?
Hello.
For those of you following along, this is presentation number 5 of NASPA for me, so I will punch your cards on the way out. 6 will be tomorrow, so if you collect the whole set, you get something free. I won't tell you what it is.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. No,
Great.
not really. But what we're here to talk to you today is a little bit about the concept of flipping and what it means to flip either a classroom environment or a training environment as well. So we're not just going to talk about what would happen in the classroom, but also for those of you that might run trainings for your staff. We're going to talk a little bit about how you could do that too. So applicable to both the faculty in the audience as well as the practitioners who may be working in these types of environments. So a little bit about myself. My name is Paul Brown. I'm currently a faculty member, an adjunct faculty member at Merrimack College, which is how I know Susan. And I'm a full-time PhD student from Boston College. I recently took a job as Assistant Vice President and Dean of Students, interim, at Fashion Institute of Technology. And I'm passionate about technology. That is what my research interest is in. It's more specifically in social media, but a lot of these things overlap, and some of the concepts are certainly very applicable across contexts.
Hello, everyone. My name is Susan Marine. I am an assistant professor, and I direct the program in higher education at Merrimack College, which is in about 20 miles north of Boston. And Paul and I work and teach together and share a fondness and enthusiasm for technology. In my case, my primary interest in technology is in helping and advancing student learning. So what I'm going to talk about with you today, as well as Paul, is sort of how we use technology to engage students differently in the classroom and in a way that we've both seen has very powerful effect.
Great. And this session is Twitter friendly, so those of folks that are watching at their home institutions right now can still engage in the conversation through the back channel. We're going to use the hashtag #SAFlipped. Just a few minutes ago, I tweeted out a link to where you can find these slides as well as a few additional resources. So if you search through that, the link will then redirect you actually to my site. So if you're not in with Twitter, you can just go to paulgordonbrown.com, and it's one of the first few blog posts on there. So you can see our slides later or refer to them as you need to. All right, goals for the session.
So our goals for today are to, in our short 50 minutes together, are to try to do a few different things. First of all, we want to talk a little bit about some of the research and data that supports the practice of flipping and other technological innovations in the classroom. This research is relatively nascent. It's not a full body of work yet, but we think there's enough there to provide you with a little bit of a promising platform for what you might do with flipping in your work. We want to talk a little bit about the benefits and the concerns related to doing flipping in the classroom and in the training space. There's lots of great things about it, but there's also some challenges, and we're not going to Pollyanna or sugarcoat it today. We're going to try to give you both. We're going to talk a little bit about the platforms and some of the digital tools that we use in our work in classroom and training flipping. And we're going to try to talk a little bit about how much time, resources, and other kinds of human capital investment flipping requires. We would argue it's pretty manageable for both a full-time faculty member and a full-time administrator who also is a professor. We're going to try to demystify that a bit.
Yeah. So our kind of outline today is we're going to give you a little bit of background on some of these concepts. We're going to use an example from teaching, which is what Susan has actually done in the classroom, actually put that into practice. We're going to talk about an example of training, which actually is something we projected. So we actually haven't executed it, but we used the same concepts, thought through how that might look. My background is actually in residence life, and I used to do training for quite a while, so I'm at least familiar with already some of the struggles one might encounter in that environment. Finish up with a little bit of technology. What are some of the platforms? What are some of those resource pieces? And then leave a good healthy portion for Q&A, depending on your approach to the topic. So first off, a little bit of background about this. When it comes to traditional methods of teaching, right, which is actually exactly what we're doing right now.
Ironic, yes.
Is that the traditional methods, the learning's up here, right? We're the ones providing knowledge to you, and you are passively consuming it. And those models, lectures are often common. That's really that mode that many higher education classes still today are taught in, is that you've got the sage on the stage and the talking through the lectures. But that also, too, means that there's a lot of structures that are barriers between the student and the teacher. It's not a co-constructed experience, right? If we harken back to Marcia Baxter-Magola's work, as well as some of our contemporary theorists, you don't see that in these traditional type environments. And technology and flipping, what it really does is it starts to break down those barriers. Social media, technology, all that broad range of kind of technology we have out there doesn't like to be constrained, doesn't really like barriers, doesn't like that kind of setup. It doesn't work very well for it, so it works actually against it. And so that's really what we're going to talk about today, is how we can use this as a way of accommodating diverse learning styles, bringing more people in the classroom, being able to speak to them in different modes and different methods of learning, so our visual learners, our auditory learners, all the different ways in which one may learn. As well as how to create it as a more co-constructed experience, right? So you're bringing both the knowledge of the student and the knowledge of the instructor together to build something. And that's the thing that excites us, I think, really about flipping and what it can be. So do you want to give us just like a little brief about what flipping is?
Sure. So flipping is a philosophy more than anything. It's a philosophy and a practice. And the philosophy says, I'm going to give my students a solid foundation of knowledge and information before they walk in the classroom space, so that the classroom space can be dedicated to engaging them in learning activities. So instead of thinking of learning as something that I deliver to my students in that 3-hour time block on a Monday or Wednesday night, I think of it as I'm giving them the preparation, all the tools they'll need. And I like to think of it as a bit of a parachute, so that when they come to class, they're ready to jump out of the plane and we're ready to get started.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Thanks.
Yeah. So really flipping uses class time smartly. When we have, beyond just thinking of someone in a seat, how can we use the space that we have to be able to interact with each other in a really rich way? How can we use it in a way that it's best suited for? And so I want to show you this kind of quadrant look that's used in talking about technology and the learning process. It was developed by Michael Staten. And he was looking at higher education. So don't worry, we'll zoom in. I see some of you kind of squinting. We'll zoom in. He was looking at higher education institutions and kind of the online space, meaning MOOCs and some of the competitors to traditional higher education, and said, okay, well, if we look at all the different things that's accomplished in college, what things are best suited, seem to be best suited to technology, and which ones are the harder ones to crack that maybe we haven't figured out yet? So if we start up in the upper left-hand quadrant there, you'll see knowledge acquisition. This includes expert information, delivery formats and modalities, pathways and sequencing. This is the easiest thing to deliver online. A lot of online platforms have already kind of cracked this, right? How do I learn basic facts about things, the knowledge? That's very easy. As we move around the quadrants, though, it gets a little bit more difficult, or things that we haven't figured out yet. So now we've got access to opportunities. Signals of aptitude, a credential of accepted value, an affiliate network, so being able to network with peers at the institution. Online learning has not done that as well as perhaps a traditional environment was. So now we're going to get even more difficult. Cognitive and employable skills, models of thinking and doing, facilitated practice, coaching and mentorship. Those are things that really in an online space haven't been done as much. And if you think about, as we talk about flipping, that's using our classroom time, the benefits of that opportunity to do these very things. So a lot of the technology will offload the first quadrant, the knowledge, onto before class and using the technology platforms that can do that well. And then we're going to use the classroom time for these things that it can do well. So we finally end up on the final quadrant, which is personal transformation, and it says a culture of personal exploration, a secured life transition, a rite of passage. Who is responsible for this work at the university? Everyone. But what conference are we at? The student affairs people, right? This is probably the hardest thing to replicate. So oftentimes when I talk about this, one of the things I tell student affairs administrators is there's a big opportunity for us to make an argument that the value added of college, that of residential experience, or at least a traditional university setting experience, comes from us. That's not as easily replicated online. We might get to the point where that is at least approximated or maybe completely replicated. I don't know that that will ever maybe fully happen outside of virtual reality, but that's probably a little too science fiction-y. But there are things that we provide value that I think the online space has a really hard time trying to figure out how do they do that.
And as a result, we would never make the argument that a general day-to-day student affairs function should be moved entirely to technology. There are ways that technology can be used to facilitate that, particularly for people like distance learners, adult learners, folks that are not necessarily well served in the traditional space. But our argument is we use those tools when it's most pragmatic and most effective, and then we resort to in-person human contact when the learning is advanced that way.
Yeah, and I think as we'll find, technology platforms, at first it was like, everything can go online. The MOOC is going to solve everything, right? And we'll be done and we'll be out of business. But really, I think what people are finding is certain online things are good at certain things, very specific things. So we'll use them for that. And where they're not good, then we won't. So it's not that it'll be completely replaced, but you use it more intelligently.
Right. So we also wanted to talk with you a little bit about why we think this is the prime moment to sort of embrace thinking and practice around flipping. The first reason is because with each passing week, literally, and month and year, the technology at our fingertips that's both affordable and easy to use is improving rapidly, so that we are no longer having to do things. The first time I tried to flip, I had a classroom call in to a conference call number, and I flipped through slides that they were holding in their hands as paper. That's not exactly the ideal flipping situation, right? So now the tools that we have make it so much easier, and I just want to disabuse you of the notion that you have to be very technologically skilled, like someone like Paul, in order to do this well, because I am not. Oh, sorry, Roger. And I'm very conscious of the fact that I wouldn't recommend this to folks who have, we don't have unending time to learn this, right? So the technology has vastly improved, and it's gotten much more user-friendly. All of us are facing greater calls in our work for accountability about what we do. The ability to demonstrate student learning outcomes is a very real and necessary part of our work. Our argument is that flipping advances that. You are able to measure and report back on student learning outcomes much more efficiently and effectively when you employ flipping. And finally, although the research is fairly sparse, there is one very promising study where 2 faculty members compared students who used traditional learning in the classroom versus students who did not throughout the course of an entire semester. And what they found was the students who participated in the flipping component of the course did much better in course outcomes. Statistically significantly better, but also felt better about the learning experience. So there is some sparse but meaningful evidence that this actually works. So we know that there's a lot of advantage to thinking about framing our work with students as problem-based learning, right? So when we have students in a training environment or in a classroom, what we really want them to be able to develop, if we think hard about what it is, we want them to be flexible and adaptable in the way that they understand and use knowledge. We want them to be able to problem solve, both individually and collectively with others. We want them to be self-directed in their learning. We want them to collaborate meaningfully, and we want them to be intrinsically motivated to learn. These are all things that are enabled and supported by flipping. And in fact, to some extent, they're required or necessary for flipping. We'll talk about that more when we share our examples. So here's the catch about flipping. I promised that I wasn't going to say this is the be-all and end-all and it will solve all of our problems. The catch to flipping is that initially, there's evidence that suggests that students resist it. They're a little bit uncomfortable with it. I have to watch the lecture before I come to class or to the training space. I've never had to do that before. This is, for some folks, a little bit of a tricky wicket because you want them to take initiative for their learning and come to class, as I said, with the parachute on. Lots of students and lots of adult learners as well like passive learning. It's much easier to be able to sit and write than it is to walk in the classroom and right out of the gate start applying your knowledge. So we need to acknowledge that students may bristle a bit at first, and that's okay. At the end of the day, we know, at least to some extent, that students are learning more and better, and I want to propose that we might be okay with getting comfortable with the idea that they don't love it right away. They will come to. I have certainly seen this to be true in my graduate program. The summer class where we flip, that I'm going to talk about in a minute, this is uncomfortable. By March, they're into it. Give me the lecture so I can watch it at home on my own time in my pajamas, and I'm ready to come to class and problem solve. So I would encourage you to know that there's just a bit of a hump that you have to get over, and by the 3rd or 4th year of RA training or parametric training, it will be the new normal. So what about lecturing? Well, it's fun to be an expert, right? Here's Paul and I up here right now, pretending to be. You know, we do know a few things to be true definitively. Video lecture and in-person lecture are as effective. Sometimes we think that they won't be because students don't have the opportunity to ask questions. But the reality is that when students have the possibility to revisit and revisit material, they understand it better and they understand it more effectively. The classroom space where they're asked to apply it is where they get to ask and get the questions answered. So it's not that you're giving that up, you're just shifting its time frame. Students in every bit of research that I've read about flipping do watch the videos. Some people say, well, what if they don't watch the videos? Well, evidence shows that whether attached to a quiz experience at the beginning of class or just in general, students report watching the videos and being able to recite the content. Our students do generally enjoy technology, and we need to remember that. So the idea that they're never going to watch it and I'm going to be right back where I started doesn't appear to be true in the research so far. What I've learned from my experiences with flipping, shorter is better for video lecture. 20 minutes to 25 minutes is really about all that people can absorb in an easily processed way and pass through on a slide lecture. But being able to watch that repeatedly and have concepts revisited repeatedly appears to play out more effectively for them in the learning space. And it is important to have some kind of accountability, such as a quiz, or I often use Jeopardy or things like that in my classroom, which feel a little bit lower stakes, to ensure that students are in fact learning the material that they're getting in the lecture. So there is one study conducted by Day and Foley, as I mentioned earlier, where they compared students throughout the semester in a flip versus non-flip environment, and they did find that there were significant gains in achievement among the students who flipped. So hopefully there will be more research in the coming years, but at the moment, we're still seeing a lot of research where folks will compare groups who flip for a week or two with other groups, and we really need longer learning spaces and more learning spaces that are using flipping in higher education.
Okay.
So, should we keep going or should we stop and see if there are questions?
Let's pause for some questions. Does anyone have any
questions, thoughts? Yeah.
So, does the video lecture take the place of assigned reading, or how does that fit?
Great question. So in my case, I'll speak to in the classroom, it does not take the place of assigned reading. Often what I do is recommend that my students read first and then watch the lecture, because the lecture will pick up pieces of the reading. It will make more sense to them if they read the readings first. I will say that I have amended or abbreviated reading to some extent, because some of the concepts I wanted them to get through reading, I now feel I can articulate better through the recorded lecture space, but I wouldn't say it's a one-for-one trade-off.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes?
With the quizzes, are you doing them embedded into the flipping or in the classroom when you next meet?
In my case, it's in the classroom when we next meet. It's the lead activity to find out where is the group with respect to their knowledge acquisition.
And that was in relation to whether the quizzes are done online during it or
Oh yes,
or
thank you for
beforehand.
repeating the question. Yes.
So-
Yeah.
With the 20 to 25-minute video lectures, if you need to cover more than that, will you just break them up and have multiple speakers?
Yep. Yeah, there may be 6 or 7 of them in a course-long module or even more. But the point is to say the 20 to 25 minutes of really well-designed lecture material should be quite sufficient for the beginning of a class where you're going to apply concepts.
Yeah. And even too, if you do a longer lecture, if you want to chunk it into the individual places, like the question about the quizzes, do you do that even before the classroom? That's an option. In fact, during a training environment, I think that's even a better option to go with. There could be the opportunity to do mini video lecture quiz, just to break that up so it's not one monolithic experience.
Yeah, my colleagues who use flipping in the math classroom will do a module quiz, again, keeping to the 20 to 25 minute lecture, but they'll do several of those prior to a class period. And then again, they'll spend the class period doing problem solving.
All right, yeah.
Do you have any platforms that you might recommend for presenting information to students on?
Yeah. Platforms to recommend in relation to doing this. We'll actually talk about that at the end. We've got a little technology section, so we're going to get there.
We will. Yes?
Okay.
And you still have the same amount of time in the classroom as you would if it wasn't flipped.
That's right.
Isn't implicit in the classroom.
No, it doesn't amend or abbreviate the classroom time. And I think the tricky part about that is because the energy level needs to be higher to keep moving from exercise to exercise, it's important to remember that. And I actually have incorporated more breaks in my class as a result because we are moving around more, talking more, working more with material. So rather than one 15-minute break, I might have 2 7-minute breaks.
Okay. I think someone needs to get remiked. Any other questions before we jump in to some of the content? Because the next section is Susan's part, so that's why you have to ask me a question. Yes?
I'm actually more curious about implementation and the buy-in for this kind of model.
Yeah.
Like a project level arts institution, and I'm wondering how I work in the career development sector, how I could potentially help introduce this in some capacity.
Yeah. The question was about the buy-in into this process, and so trying to then sell that. You know, when you look at also teaching and training environments, or even if it's not even a training environment, it's a volunteer, you know, like I want to do some self-directed learning, so I want to jump into this space. You've got different tools, right? In the classroom, you've got kind of that stick and carrot, because you've got the grade and you have the go to class time. In a training environment, you don't always necessarily have that. You know, as someone who worked with resident assistants for a number of years, RA training is not most of their favorite thing to do. And by the time you get into about day 3 or 4, you're going to be hearing about it. One of the ways when we implemented some pieces of this, we sell it as a time saver. We sell it as, in part, self-directed learning so that you can do it when you want to. And so some of those benefits to it. There's also a benefit, at least I think we can say this at this time in history, this is what you will encounter in the work environment, right? So if you're going to prepare to go into that, this is where everyone's moving. So by understanding this now, you're actually going to be in a better place in the future for as far as employment goes. Mm-hmm. So you have with the training, and when you have students who might just kind of do a one-off section with you, it's a little bit tougher. But having that kind of freely available and talking a little bit about the benefits can kind of mitigate that a little bit. Mm-hmm.
Great, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my classroom space that I use course flipping in. And by way of context, I teach in a graduate program for higher ed master's students. And the summer course, the intro or foundational course for all of my students is called Higher Education in American Society. And last year, together with my colleague Z. Nicolazzo, who was also teaching a section of the course, we decided to implement flipping technology to see how it worked. Why did we do this? Well, there are a few different reasons. First of all, this course is incredibly content dense. We cover the entire 375-year history of higher education, as well as foundational concepts around equity, access, retention, persistence, and success in 6 weeks' time. It is jam-packed. We have the students read a couple of full books, along with about 30 to 35 readings. So for our purposes, we want to give the students a lot of information, but we also want to get them right away working with it in the classroom. So in that 6-week span, the way that we created the course initially was to flip every other session. So we have 12 sessions twice a week for 6 weeks. we decided to flip every other session, both as an experimental process, but also to see if we could make some discernment in our own informal way in a comparison. There's a couple of other reasons why we did this. Because it's the introductory course, we wanted to set a tone right away that we believe, as faculty in this program, that the best way to be a meaningfully skilled practitioner is to use data, information, reading, media, et cetera, to scaffold your skill set that you're going to take into a meeting space, a student conversation space, a training space, et cetera. So we really wanted to get the students thinking about, when you're working in student affairs full-time, you're not going to sit in your office reading articles all day. So how can we use flipping to advance your ability to take knowledge and apply it right away? And also, frankly, I've been teaching this class for 6 years, and I really wanted to do something new. So I'll be honest. That's part of why I did it. So the elements of the flip. So for each session that we flipped, we did 4 basic things. The first thing that we did was, in addition to providing the students with a pre-recorded video lecture using PowerPoint and explain everything, we alternated. We provided them with a pre-class lecture that they could watch on their own time. And we gave them usually about a week to a week and a half. We didn't have them all ready at the start of the semester. I would do that differently if I could. At the very beginning of each class session, we have all the students in the class take a live quiz using either Google Forms, which is very simple. They can pull it up on their screen and fill it out, and you can watch the results come in real time. We also occasionally alternated that with a tool called Socratic, which does the same thing. Then, after instant scoring the quiz, where you can see the students' responses, but you don't see their identities associated with them, we were able to walk through the quiz and make sure that we were all on the same page around the foundational concepts that would be used that day. And after doing that and getting a good sense of where everyone was and clarifying any mystifying or confusing aspects of the video lecture, we then would move into 3 graduated activities per class period. Now, our model of flipping is one that I learned at a wonderful conference called the Teaching Conference, the Teaching Professor Conference. If any of you are really interested in teaching and training, I highly recommend this learning experience. It was terrific. And I learned at that conference about the fact that Bloom's taxonomy, which most of us are at least somewhat familiar with, suggests that student learning happens in this graduated way. In order to get students where we want them to be, which is at the evaluative judgment level, we have to start at the ground level with knowledge acquisition, moving up into comprehension, then application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. So the learning activities we provided in the flipped classroom were designed to make sure that that's how we approached it. Start with the basics, move up in sophistication, frankly, with each graduated exercise.
And if you want to go back to that slide for a minute, if you look at the knowledge and comprehension, that is the upper left quadrant of that 4-quadrant thing we showed you, right? The part that they'll be doing online, which is exactly what online does well, and then when you get into application analysis, synthesis, evaluation, that's what's occurring in the classroom, which is exactly the part that online has a little bit more of a difficult time replicating.
Right. So just as one example, and then I'll hand it over to Paul to talk about the training space. We started out in one week with the flip with a pre-class lecture on the history of higher education from 1800 to 1920. This period of our history in American higher education was an incredibly fertile time for the expansion of colleges, but as most of you probably know, the biggest deal during this time was the way that it became a space for equity, inclusion, and access for groups that had never been present in higher education before, including marginalized genders of students, folks from underrepresented minority groups, et cetera, right? So we really focus very intentionally on helping students understand how that process of greater inclusion happened through the lecture. Then at the beginning of the class, we played a Jeopardy game. We put the students into teams. We went through each of the micro periods of the roughly century and a quarter. We asked progressively harder questions based on the scoring. And we first had students, for the first half of the game, offer answers individually, and then we put them in teams to show the difference between individual learning strengths and collaborative learning strengths. Then we moved into an application exercise. So going back to the taxonomy for a minute, now we think, okay, they've got knowledge and they've got comprehension. We've covered the important stuff. But now we want them to think about how colleges and universities' missions either were founded to be more inclusive or expanded to be more inclusive during this period. So we gave them case studies of colleges that became coeducational during this period. We gave them studies about, excuse me, Bennett and Spelman colleges and other colleges that were founded to support students who had been systematically excluded from higher education. And we talked about how their missions linked up with their evolving histories over time. So they worked in groups to connect the dots between the mission, the group best served in that institution, and the barriers to that service. Then we moved on to the next exercise where we asked them to build a university from scratch. So in order to do that, they had to both, again, going back to the taxonomy, break things down, break concepts down in the process of understanding how that democratization process happened, and then put them back together in order to design a college that was both historically accurate, but also meaningfully inclusive during this period. And so that was the synthesis piece. They did it in small groups in the classroom, and then I sent them on their way at the classroom to go back home and flesh out their design further and show me that as individuals, after having some practice with it in the classroom, they could synthesize information into their own design as individual students. So each of the exercises takes them a little bit further in what they need to do to apply the concepts and then what they need to do to demonstrate their mastery.
Great. So let's look at what this might look in how it might look in a training environment. So if we were to use the training environment as an example, what I'm going to do is talk about student conduct. Student conduct training that we might use for a staff is pretty fertile ground for, I think, a flipping type scenario. So if we think about the components of a student conduct training, we know that we want students to understand the actual code itself. So we want them to know about what's in that code and how the conduct process works. Then we also want them to be able to successfully confront an incident and be able to write a report about it, right? So those are really kind of the main takeaways from this training experience we want to get. So if we think about this in a flipped way, how might we do this? Before they get to class, which would be on the left-hand side here, have them read through the code. That is not something we need to go over bit by bit in the classroom. That's something they can read and consume on their own. And use that quiz as an accountability measure, right? So something that they'd actually take even before they show up to training the next day, or if this is even in the summer prior to the training, or at some other point, finish this quiz. Then use the time with a supervisor, or you could also use time in a training space to let's review that quiz and find out where it is that you don't understand what's occurring, what you had difficulty with if you have questions about that. So use that space to actually then dialogue about it. Oop. The furthering this on, and I've done this before, is create a video of an incident, right? So something happens. I will tell you also, if you're working with student staff members, they like to see professional staff members act out an incident in a residence hall. They think that's pretty funny. And so it's also a little bit fun for them to watch. And review a sample report that highlights important and successful components of what a report would look like. Something that shows actually what this report may include and what it should include. So it would highlight saying, here's what's happening right here. Make sure you include this. And then have them write their own report. Have them actually give that a go. On the right then, when we're getting into the group time, which would be our equivalent of the classroom time, get into groups led by pro staff and RAs, and use that as a time to, let's workshop through some of those incident reports. Let's look at them. What did you do? Review the video, discuss what's going on. So you're actually using that time. There's the problem solving, right? Like actually watching the video again together, talking about what's going on there. Did the RA confront that correctly, incorrectly? What might they have done better? As well as look at those reports again. So then you can go through that revision process, they rewrite that, and you can review it. So now you're trying to bring it all again back together and into the synthesis. So there are ways that you can use these same kind of flipping concepts in a training type environment, thinking about what are the knowledge tasks that are involved here, and how could we move those maybe out of the space and use some of the class time we have to do some of the things that are a little bit higher order on that taxonomy. And the thing is, we already do some things like this, right? So folks that are familiar with residence life environments know that behind closed doors is usually a component of most trainings. That's a lot of flipping right there, right? Doing the application, having to go through it. And what's the session that RAs usually say was the most useful training? It's usually this one. Because they're taking all the pieces that they had and applying it and then trying to figure it out and seeing other people do it. And so we already have some components like this probably built into some of the way we do things with experiential learning. And the trick is, how can we then offload some of those knowledge tasks to an earlier period and utilize technology to be able to do that. So that's also how it might look in a training environment. So we did want to talk a little bit too about kind of the technology behind things. So what are some mechanics, right? The nitty gritty of things like that. As Susan said, you don't have to be an expert, okay? There's no really complex tool that you need to learn to be able to do this. There are some that you could learn that might have more bells and whistles and do more complex things. But if that's not where you're going, using some very simple, free available tools to you is an easy way to go. I think the thing that you have to do and be careful about when you start using technological tools like this is making sure that you're using the technology for the right reasons. So some people will see technology and they get enamored with the bells and whistles of it, like, ooh, you can do zooming effects and things like that, and forget the outcomes and the learning, which is really why you're using the technology, right? Something like this, where I zoom in for you and help you, is using at least a zoom feature in an intelligent way. Everything else that's just pointless motion, just to be pretty and cool, is the wrong place that you want to focus your emphasis. So the technology is a tool, not a learning outcome. They might learn how to use technology maybe in the course of this, but that's not really what your outcome is in these environments. So you will not be able to read this, which I know. It is available through that blog post that we provided, but I'm going to zoom in on a few things. Edge Ventures, what they did was they took all the different vendors and technology providers that are available and looked at the different areas that they touch within the higher education realm. So up in the upper left there, you see admissions and enrollment, student success and instruction, and advancement. And then they actually go in and they break it down by who are some of the vendors that are working in this space related to adaptive learning platforms, or social management learning platforms, social listening platforms, career assessment and certification. And so they kind of took all those providers so that if you want to know, oh, this is the area I'm focusing in, here's some providers that have some technological tools. So that's available on the website that I mentioned, that if you want to dig in that, and not even just related to flipping, there's actually a lot of great information in here. There are some tools that you can kind of dig into more deeply from some of these providers. You notice there's a few that show up quite a bit there. Pearson shows up quite a bit. So there's a few providers that do a lot of different things.
I will also just say that for the purposes of the classroom flipping I did, again, I work at a relatively low resource college that doesn't have a lot of money to spend on technology. So I used a $9.99 app called Explain Everything to do my video lectures. They are easy to do. You can put up the slides, you can move them over from PowerPoint, you can do voiceover, and you can record it as many times as you want until you think you sound mildly acceptable. I mean, I'll be honest, I never love hearing my own voice but the students tell me, yeah, that sounds exactly like you. So I'm like, okay, well. But it's a wonderful tool. It uploads to any platform, learning platform, Blackboard, Canvas, what have you, as an MP4. Students can watch it on their phone, they can watch it on their laptops, they can watch it on their tablets. And it worked out great. And as I mentioned before, I use Google Everything for my quizzing, for my record keeping, for my uploading of documents and other materials, and it works great. It's free. I've had no glitches or bugs. And so the investment of money you'd need to make in order to flip effectively is very minimal.
Yeah, and some of the tools that I've used, I even use Apple's Keynote, which is kind of their PowerPoint version. You can just do the recording right in there and export as a movie. So you don't even need anything other than the presentation software to be able to do that. I made a video for a group the other day and just used that. And it actually saves embedded within the Keynote too. So if I ever want to then export it later, or I could even play it for you now, I don't even need to make it into a movie to do that. Right. So Profcast is another one that's been around, that's been pretty successful, that a lot of people use. But there's some very free, easily available tools. I also want to talk a little bit too about some tools that faculty are using, some of the research in that. Pearson does a report, or has done a report up until now, just about every year for the past 3-4 years, looking at social media use, and they define social media quite broadly within that, looking at what some faculty are using in that space. And so some of the free tools that are already faculty are using, blogs and wikis are by far the most used technology. By a lot of faculty. And so using that type of blogging concept, using wikis as well, which would be just like that technology that you'd find in Wikipedia where everyone can collaborate and change a document together. But also podcasts, so there's your video capture right there. It's the same thing basically as a podcast. As well as Facebook and LinkedIn and a few other social media sites. When it comes to, actually it reminds me with the podcast, if there is a lecture, you can also use pre-existing video content. Right? It doesn't have to be something that you're actually recording yourself. So if you have video podcasts from Higher Ed Live, Student Affairs Live, some of those pre-existing resources out there, they can also function as a stand-in for that lecture.
It's also very easy to set up your own YouTube channel and load your videos there so students can go into your channel and access them. And sometimes the sound quality and sort of visual is a little better than just uploading an MP4.
Yeah.
So.
And also within this, the research which I thought was interesting to share, perceived barriers to social media use by faculty. And again, technology also related to this. Number one is integrity of student submissions. How do I know it's them doing it, right? How do I know that's them completing that quiz if they're doing it online beforehand? Concerns about privacy, this relates to maybe using some tools like YouTube where you have a personal account as well. So when you kind of get outside the walled garden of the learning management system you might use at your institution, Blackboard, Canvas, or whatever those may be. Some of those concerns start coming up. Grading and assessment, how do you measure the effectiveness? How are you, when you use some of these outside tools, how do they integrate with the tools your university provides? These are a lot of the barriers and concerns that folks have. And so those are things that you can work through, but requires you really to kind of problem solve that as we go.
The other thing I think that we would say is true about this space that makes it a little bit challenging for us as the instructors or as the leaders of the learning is you can't really do that thing that maybe you've done before where you give your students an exercise and they go off and do it and you sit in the classroom and maybe check your email or read a chronicle or something. It really requires engagement. When I flip a class period, I spend the whole period visiting the groups, talking to the groups about the activity they're working on, prompting with additional questions, making sure that those folks who are more likely to be a little bit quieter or introverted get drawn out into the discussion at a level comfortable for them. So I think it is a much more active kind of teaching, and it doesn't enable us to you can't just let the group go and say, okay, here's your worksheet, go do it. And I think that's both a blessing and in some ways a challenge. I'm a lot more tired at the end of a flipped teaching period, but I also feel a lot more gratified about what I saw happen in that classroom.
Great. So we wanted to, I am definitely more mics now than I was before. So some Q&A. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes or so to go anywhere you want to go. Yeah?
So the U.S. Department of Education says 2 hours outside of the classroom for every hour in. If I'm now doing, I'm a student, if I'm now doing 10 hours of watching videos, shouldn't that then reduce the class time?
Oh, I suppose it could theoretically, but like I said earlier, I haven't developed the materials and the pre-class preparation in a way that it's astronomically more challenging. The 20 to 25 minute video lecture that they can watch repeatedly if they need to, but also don't need to, and can watch and take notes on the same way they do as when I'm standing in front of the classroom, that's really the only additional time. They have to read anyway, they have to scan the chronicle anyway, all of those things are the same. So it really doesn't add time. What it does is, you wouldn't have spent 20 minutes lecturing in the classroom. You would have spent 45 minutes to an hour, because if you're anything like me, you're gonna go off on tangents. Somebody's gonna ask a great question, and then you're gonna spend 15 minutes talking about the GI Bill, which isn't really related to what you were talking about, but there it is. And you could put that in your lecture later, right? So I really think that it provides a much different climate and environment without actually a great deal of additional work for students.
Yeah. The question was in relation to the amount of in-class time versus out-class time, and how does that increase the amount of out-of-class times that you shift that?
Yeah.
I think another thing there's another trend that's happening in higher education, which is the move towards more competency-based learning. So the Badges for Learning project that's really taking off with Haystack, which is in partnership with the Department of Education and the Gates Foundation, looking at the credit hour, which is really just a measure of your seat time, really isn't a great measure of learning. And so there's also some pushback against that, which I think flipping then plays into that, that as we work through some of these changes that are going on in our educational space, that's playing alongside this too. So that's going to play into this space.
And I don't think any of us have figured out how to quantify or measure the actual out-of-classroom time. So I asked my students at the end of the semester, did flipping require a great deal more of preparation from you before class? And to a person, they said no. But it did require them to walk in the class ready to work, and not to ease in and kick back and then listen to me.
So maybe it means they are actually doing the 2 hours outside of class for every hour in class, whereas maybe they weren't before.
Quite possible.
You mentioned that in your class you did sort of every other session.
Yes.
Would you recommend easing in that way, or now would you say go all in?
I recommend it for you if you'd like to try it to ease in that way, and here's why.
What was the question, Susan?
I'm sorry. The question was, would you recommend flipping every other session of a class or a training experience right out of the gate, or would you do it the way I did it? I'm sorry, not the way I did it, which would be to do it every time. Because it does require a bit more preparation on your end, and because it requires you to have full confidence in the pre-recorded lecture to cover all the material that you want to, I think it was easier last summer to do what I did. This summer, teaching the same course, I think I'm going to flip every session. I really do, because my confidence is built up now and I see the value of it. Incidentally, we didn't mention this, but flipping is also, I think, a really advantageous way to set up a class structure for folks who need more time with thinking about and learning the concepts. Whether that's because they process information differently, whether that's because English is their second language. For those folks, I heard loud and clear from them, this really helped me because I didn't have to just hear you once and hope I got it down. So there's lots of advantages to it.
I think the other thing that helps too in thinking about a training environment where you may have different staff members of varying degrees of presentation ability, it does allow you to maybe have some certain people that can do something particularly well and target that a little bit better, rather than waiting on, okay, who are the staff we have this year, who happens to be an expert in this area, and kind of having that uneven quality from year to year. Also, I think kind of helps even that out a little bit.
And you don't want to pack the session so tightly that you don't have any room for taking up concepts that are more complicated. My students last summer really struggled with some of the foundational information about formulas used for financial aid. So after the flipping and the quiz, I realized we need to spend more time on that. So I actually set one of the activities aside and we went back to the Department of Ed's homepage and really talked about, okay, how does the Pell Grant get distributed? How do PLUS loans get distributed? That was something that my relatively brief coverage of it in the lecture didn't serve them well.
Funny story about that, we were doing some kind of flipped environment in the class I was teaching. Don't do that during a government shutdown when you can then no longer access any of the educational statistics online because you can't get into the website.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, that was a surprise.
Talk about over-reliance on technology,
right,
perhaps.
Right. So one more, I think we have time for one more question.
Yes.
I was curious, and I don't want to open up a can of worms here, but 10 years from now, when we're a little bit more accepting of this and more resources are allocated towards the advancement of learning in the classroom, where do you really see this going?
Yeah. I think for myself, I talked a little bit at the beginning about this idea when MOOCs were first really hot, it was like, that's going to replace everything. And there's an author called Anya Kamenetz who has this book called DIYU, which is basically the tagline is what? The coming of edupunks, edupreneurs, and then edge is something. I don't remember what the third one was. But basically this idea that everyone's going to be self-directed learners and you're going to piece together your education from all these different sources, and so that kind of renders the university fairly obsolete in some regards. I think there will be more people who are already predisposed to that who will do that and can do that. I do not believe that to be the entirety of the US population, right? Like, I know that when I've taken fully online classes, that hasn't worked well for me. That might work well for some other people, doesn't work well for me. So there's a kind of a diverse array of learning styles that I think as we see this kind of disruption and shakeup, there'll be different players in the space, and even our educational practices will be a little bit different, but it's gonna rest in some kind of happy medium where people can enter and leave out of the educational environment in different ways. So if you want that residential experience, you can kind of have that. I think my biggest concern is that going back to that quadrant piece, we know that a lot of the work that student affairs folks do is pretty key and important and part of usually a residential experience. So do you create this class of, well, if you have enough money, you can have a 4-year college degree at a residential institution and have access to all the networks and the alumni and all the great things that come along with that. And I'm sorry if you're of low SES, you get online-only classes. And so that concerns me, probably most going forward.
I also think that we've got a lot of room to grow in our understanding of being able to assess the collaborative learning space in the classroom in an effective way. It's very difficult, I will say, in my experience, to discern the difference between a student who's just sort of naturally quiet and shy from someone who's underprepared. Right, because if you're doing an active, hands-on activity and you've got a group of 5 students and 3 of them are really getting in there and talking and grappling and 2 of them aren't, my capacity to assess whether that's because they're not fully prepared or they're just quiet is fairly limited. So I think we actually need a lot more educational research about group learning and group interactions and how to assess that more competently.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. We appreciate you being here.